Snow screams across the Asheville Mountains. In the middle of a frozen yard, a German Shepherd K9 named Coda plants himself between a 6-year-old boy and the one person who should have protected him. The child is shivering in a metallic basin, his navy blue sweater soaked in freezing water as the blizzard bites. Behind a perfect smile, his new stepmother waits for the cold to break his spirit and secure her plan to strip a grieving seal father of everything. But a lens hidden in the frost is capturing the truth. When Thorne steps out into the whiteout, the garden will shift from a playground to a crime scene, from a nightmare to a rescue. What happens next will make you believe in the fierce protection of a father and the quiet miracles of those who refuse to stay silent. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face the cold alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. The city of Asheville, North Carolina, was ensnared in the bone-chilling grip of an early December blizzard, a ruthless winter that seemed determined to bury the Blue Ridge Mountains under a suffocating shroud of white. The wind, a predatory force, howled through the narrow mountain passes, whipping fine, needle-like ice crystals against the windows of the grand estates lining the outskirts. It was a cold that didn't just nip at the skin. It seeped into the marrow, turning the world into a monochromatic landscape of stark shadows and treacherous drifts. High atop a secluded ridge stood the Everhart Manor, a sprawling timber and stone fortress that looked more like a silent monument to grief than a home. Inside, the air was heavy, with a silence so thick it felt physical, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that echoed like a slow fading heartbeat through the mahogany-paneled hallways. Ethan Thorne Everhart stood by the floor-to-ceiling library window, his silhouette a jagged outline against the flickering fireplace. At 38, Thorne was a man carved from granite and trauma. His frame was immense, the product of a decade spent as a Navy SEAL, with shoulders that seemed broad enough to carry the weight of the world, and a chest that remained barrel-stiff even in repose. His face was a map of hard-won experience, a sharp, angular jawline often shadowed by a thick, well-groomed stubble that did little to hide the faint white scar running along his temple. His eyes, once a vibrant slate gray, had turned into chips of flinty ice since the sudden passing of his first wife, Clara. He was a man of calculated movements and sparse words, his personality defined by a protective wall of stoicism that many mistook for coldness. To the outside world, he was the elite private investigator who solved the city's most impenetrable cases. To himself, he was a ghost haunting his own life, seeking solace in the objective clarity of dossiers and evidence bags because the subjective pain of his own heart was too much to bear. In the center of the plush Persian rug sat Asher Everhart, a boy of 6 whose vibrant energy was currently dampened by the somber atmosphere of the house. Dash was a striking contrast to his father's darkness, possessing his mother's golden blonde hair that fell in messy, sun-kissed tufts over a pair of wide, inquisitive cerulean eyes. He was dressed in his favorite navy blue wool sweater, a garment that was slightly pilled at the cuffs and smelled faintly of lavender, the last thing his mother had knitted for him. The Dash moniker wasn't just a nickname. It was an identity born from his inability to walk when he could run, a child who viewed the world as a series of adventures waiting to happen. Yet today, his movements were subdued, his small hands tracing the patterns in the rug with a rhythmic, nervous intensity. Guarding the boy with a vigilance that rivaled any sentry was Coda, a 7-year-old German Shepherd of regal proportions. Coda was a massive beast, 90 pounds of lean muscle and black and tan fur that shimmered under the amber lamplight. His ears were perpetually erect, swiveling toward the slightest creak of the floorboards, and his soulful brown eyes never strayed far from Dash. Coda was more than a pet. He was the family's living anchor, a retired K9 who had been trained to detect threats long before he was tasked with babysitting. He possessed a discerning temperament, a quiet intelligence that allowed him to sense the shifting emotional barometers of the humans around him. He remained pressed against Dash's side, a warm, breathing shield against the encroaching shadows. The heavy oak doors creaked open, admitting Seraphina Sarah Blackwood, the woman Thorne had married 6 months ago, in a whirlwind of desperate hope for stability. Sarah was a vision of calculated elegance, standing tall with a willow-like grace that commanded attention. Her hair was the color of midnight, styled in a sleek, unforgiving bob that framed a face of porcelain perfection. Her skin was unnaturally pale, stretched over high, sharp cheekbones, and her lips were painted a deep, blood red that never quite reached her eyes. Those eyes, a piercing pale green, were her most striking feature, often described as mesmerizing, though Coda always met them with a vibrating growl. Sarah moved with a predatory softness, her silk robes whispering against the floor. She was a socialite by trade, a woman who had mastered the art of the angelic facade, projecting an image of the grieving widower's savior, while her interior world was driven by a cold, transactional ambition. She viewed the Everhart estate not as a home to be nurtured, but as a kingdom to be conquered. "Thorne, darling, you're brooding again," Sarah's voice drifted through the room, as smooth and chilling as the ice outside. She glided toward him, her hand, long, thin fingers adorned with a massive emerald, resting on his bicep. "The storm is merely weather. We should be focused on the gala preparations, not the dark." Thorne didn't look at her, his gaze still fixed on the swirling snow. "The gala can wait, Sarah. Dash hasn't eaten much today." Sarah's expression didn't flicker, but her grip tightened almost imperceptibly. "He's just adjusting to the season, Ethan. Children are resilient. I've scheduled his piano lessons for this afternoon. Discipline is the best cure for melancholy." Observing this exchange from the doorway was Brenda Carmichael, the housekeeper who had served the Everharts for 2 decades. Brenda was a stout woman in her late 60s, her face a roadmap of kind wrinkles and her silver hair tucked into a sensible bun. She wore a constant scent of cinnamon and lemon wax, her apron pockets always containing a stray peppermint or a toy soldier. Brenda was the soul of the house, the only one who remembered the sound of Clara's laughter. She watched Sarah with a narrowed, distrustful gaze. Her intuition, honed by years of managing a household, told her that the new Mrs. Everhart was a wolf in silk clothing. She had noticed the way Dash shrunk back when Sarah entered a room, and the way Coda's hackles rose. Brenda said nothing, but her hand gripped the silver tray she carried until her knuckles turned white. As the afternoon light faded into a bruised purple dusk, the atmosphere in the manor shifted from somber to sinister. Sarah turned her attention to Dash, her smile widening into something that didn't feel like a smile at all. "Come, Dash, time for your lessons. Coda can stay here. We don't need hair on the piano bench." Dash looked up at his father, pleading silently, but Thorne was already turning back to his desk, swallowed by a new pile of case files. Dash stood up, his small frame looking tiny in the vast room, and followed Sarah out. Coda made to follow, but Sarah blocked the door with a swift, sharp movement of her heel. "Stay," she commanded, her voice dropping an octave into a hiss. Coda bared his teeth, a soundless warning, but he obeyed the unspoken rule of the house. He would not strike unless the threat was overt. The chapter closes with the image of the Everhart Manor standing isolated against the roaring North Carolina gale. Inside, the lights flickered as the wind battered the stone walls. Thorne sat in the dark, his mind miles away in a world of crime scenes, while in the dimly lit music room, the first discordant notes of a piano echoed, a lonely, shivering sound that signaled the beginning of a winter Dash would never forget. The thud of the heavy library doors shutting symbolized the wall that had been built between father and son, leaving the boy and his dog alone to face the freezing transformation of the woman who claimed to be their new mother. The transition from dusk to deep night in Asheville brought a plummeting temperature that seemed to turn the very oxygen into shards of glass. Inside the Everhart Manor, the central heating hummed with a futile persistence against the frost creeping across the window panes in intricate, jagged patterns. In the West Wing's music room, the air was unnaturally still. Dash sat on the velvet-topped piano bench, his small fingers trembling as they hovered over the ivory keys. The navy blue wool of his sweater, once a source of comfort, now felt heavy, a reminder of the warmth he was rapidly losing. Standing behind him, her shadow elongated by the flickering wall sconces, was Serafina. She didn't offer guidance. She offered observation, a cold, clinical pressure that made Dash's mind go blank. Every time a note fell flat or a rhythm faltered, the silence that followed was more piercing than a scream. Sarah's philosophy was one of refining the soul through endurance, a mantra she whispered to herself as she watched the boy's spirit fray under her gaze. As the clock struck 7, Sarah's slender, pale hand rested on Dash's shoulder, her grip firm enough to be felt through the thick wool. "That is enough for the piano, Asher. You lack focus because your body is too pampered, too soft. We shall correct that before bed." She led him toward the grand master bathroom, a space of cold Carrara marble, and gleaming chrome fixtures that felt more like a laboratory than a place of rest. The room was illuminated by a single harsh overhead light that cast deep shadows into the corners. Sarah began to turn the heavy brass handles of the bathtub, but she bypassed the hot water entirely. The sound of the rushing water was deafening in the tiled space, a hollow, splashing roar that signaled a shift from psychological pressure to physical ordeal. Dash watched in confusion, his eyes wide as he saw the steam that usually accompanied his baths missing entirely. In the hallway, Coda's claws clicked against the hardwood floor with an agitated rhythm. The German shepherd's ears were pulled back, his powerful tail tucked low, a sign of extreme distress. He had followed them as far as the threshold, but Sarah had slammed the heavy mahogany door just inches from his snout. Coda didn't bark. He began to whine, a high-pitched, mournful sound that vibrated through the wood. He knew the scent of fear, and it was currently pouring out from under that door. He began to pace, his 90-pound frame moving like a restless shadow, occasionally stopping to scratch at the base of the door with a desperate, frantic intensity. His instincts, forged in the heat of tactical deployments, were screaming at him that the Bakvak was being harmed, yet the domestic boundaries he had been trained to respect held him back from splintering the wood. Downstairs in the kitchen, Brenda Carmichael was preparing a tray of herbal tea, her movements uncharacteristically jerky. She was joined by Silas Vance, the estate's groundskeeper who had come in to escape the blizzard. Silas was a man of 70, built like an old oak tree, gnarled, sturdy, and weathered by decades of mountain winters. His face was a landscape of deep-set furrows, framed by a wild salt and pepper beard that reached his chest, and his hands were thick and calloused, stained permanently with the scent of pine resin and soil. Silas was a man of few words, possessing a quiet wisdom and a fierce loyalty to the Everhart name. He had served Thorne's father before him, and he viewed Dash as the last spark of light in a darkening house. "The dog's been carrying on for 20 minutes, Brenda," Silas grunted, his voice like gravel grinding together. "Something ain't right in the West Wing. That woman, she's got a heart like a frozen well." Brenda nodded, her lips a thin line. "I saw her carrying a metallic basin into the bathroom earlier, Silas. A basin she filled from the outdoor pump this afternoon. I thought she was cleaning, but now—" Her voice trailed off, the implication hanging in the air like a poisonous fog. Inside the bathroom, the ordeal had begun. Sarah had stripped Dash of his navy sweater, leaving him shivering in the biting draft of the room. She didn't use the large tub. Instead, she forced him into the metallic basin she had placed in the center of the floor, now filled with water that was barely a degree above freezing. When Dash's skin hit the water, the air left his lungs in a silent, jagged gasp. "Quiet, Asher," Sarah whispered, her voice a terrifying contrast to the cruelty of the act. "This is for your constitution. To be an Everhart is to be steel. Steel is tempered in the cold." She took a sponge and began to pour the icy water over his head and shoulders. Dash's teeth began to chatter violently, his small chest heaving as he tried to find air. He looked at Sarah, searching for a spark of the woman his father had married, but he found only a vacant, glassy emerald stare. She wasn't angry, she was indifferent, which was infinitely worse. To her, this wasn't punishment, it was a renovation of a human being into an asset she could control. The secondary tension escalated when Brenda, unable to sit still any longer, made her way up the stairs under the guise of delivering towels. She reached the bathroom door just as Coda let out a low, guttural growl at the sound of a muffled sob from within. Brenda knocked, her hand trembling. "Miss Hayes, Mrs. Everhart, I have the fresh linens you requested." The water stopped running. A moment later, the door cracked open just a few inches. Sarah stood there, her porcelain skin dry, her hair perfect, but the air emanating from the room was freezing. "Thank you, Brenda. Leave them on the bench. I am nearly finished with Asher's refreshment." Before Brenda could peer inside, Sarah shut the door again, the lock clicking with a finality that felt like a gavel striking. Brenda stood in the hall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked down at Coda, whose eyes were fixed on her with an almost human level of pleading. The chapter reaches its peak as the blizzard outside reaches a crescendo, a branch from an old willow tree snapping under the weight of the ice and crashing against the manor's stone exterior. The sound echoed like a gunshot, causing Thorne, still buried in his study, to finally look up from his monitors. He rubbed his tired eyes, the stubble on his jaw scratching against his palm. For a fleeting second, he felt a strange cold shiver, a tactical instinct he hadn't felt since his days in the field. He looked at the baby monitor on his desk, the one he usually kept muted. He turned the dial. He didn't hear crying. He heard the rhythmic metallic clink of a sponge hitting a basin and the sound of labored, shallow breathing. His brow furrowed, the protector in him stirring beneath the layers of grief. Chapter 2 concludes with Dash being lifted out of the basin, his skin a translucent ghostly white, and his lips a haunting shade of blue. Sarah wrapped him in a thin, coarse towel, her movements efficient and devoid of warmth. "Go to your room, Asher. Do not speak of our lesson to your father. It is our secret strength." Dash stumbled out into the hallway, his legs numb, nearly collapsing into Coda's fur. The dog immediately began to lick the boy's freezing face, trying to transfer his own body heat to the shivering child. As they retreated into the shadows of the nursery, the image of the metallic basin, still filled with the dark, frigid water, remained in the center of the marble room, a silent, chilling monument to the hidden cruelty now ruling the Everhart home. The morning following the icy ordeal in the marble bathroom brought no respite from the Asheville winter. Instead, the sky turned a bruised, heavy pewter, promising a fresh onslaught of snow. The Everhart Manor felt increasingly like a pressurized chamber, where the air was thin and every floorboard creak felt like a warning. Dash had woken up with a persistent, hacking cough, his small frame huddled inside the navy blue sweater that now seemed several sizes too large for his dwindling spirit. Thorne, consumed by a high-stakes corporate espionage case involving a rival tech firm, had left before dawn, his mind a whirlwind of digital footprints and encryption keys. He had kissed Dash's forehead in the dark, noting the clamminess of the boy's skin, but dismissing it as the common seasonal flu, a lapse in judgment that would soon haunt the corridors of his conscience. By mid-morning, the blizzard had momentarily softened into a gentle, deceptive flurry. In the yard of the neighboring estate, a charming Tudor-style house that smelled of cedar and wood smoke, Willow Ainsworth was busy clearing the stone pathway. Willow was a woman of 30, possessing a natural, unforced grace that seemed to calm the very air around her. She was a pediatric nurse at the Asheville Children's Hospital, a profession that had shaped her into a keen observer of the unspoken. Her hair was a rich chestnut brown, usually tied back in a practical braid that reached the small of her back, and her eyes were a startling, empathetic hazel that could shift from warm amber to a piercing diagnostic green. She wore a heavy shearling coat and boots, her cheeks flushed a healthy pink from the exertion. Willow was a healer by nature, having moved to the mountains to find peace after a grueling residency in a trauma center, and she carried with her a quiet strength, a soft resilience that made children trust her instinctively. Accompanying Willow was Daisy, a 3-year-old golden retriever who was the antithesis of Coda's stern vigilance. Daisy was a golden cloud of enthusiasm, her tail a perpetual motion machine that dusted the snow into fine sprays. She was soft-mouthed and gentle, a therapy dog in training who lived for belly rubs and the occasional stray biscuit. As Willow shoveled, Daisy suddenly froze, her ears perking up toward the Everhart fence line. She let out a soft, inquisitive boof, a sound she reserved for friends. Willow looked up and saw a small figure huddled under the skeletal branches of a weeping willow tree that marked the property boundary. It was Dash, and he was alone. Dash was kneeling in the snow, his gloveless hands trying to scoop up ice to build something, but his movements were lethargic. Coda was with him, but the German Shepherd wasn't playing. He was standing over the boy, his body a literal windbreak against the mountain gusts. Coda's gaze met Willow's, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something that looked like desperation in the dog's intelligent eyes. Willow dropped her shovel and approached the fence. "Hey there, Dash. That's a very impressive fortress you're building," she called out, her voice melodic and intentionally light to avoid startling him. Dash looked up, and Willow's professional instincts immediately went on high alert. The boy's face was unnaturally pale, save for 2 feverish spots of red on his cheeks, and his lips carried a faint, lingering tint of lavender blue that shouldn't have been there, even in the cold. "It's a shield," Dash whispered, his voice raspy. "For the cold." Willow frowned slightly, her heart tightening. "Why don't you come over for a bit? I just pulled some ginger molasses cookies out of the oven, and Daisy is dying for someone to throw her favorite tennis ball." Dash glanced back at the manor, his eyes darting toward the high windows where the silhouette of Seraphina could be seen moving behind the sheer curtains. He hesitated, then the lure of warmth and a friendly face won over. He crawled through the hop in the fence, Coda following with a protective, low-slung gait. Inside Willow's warm kitchen, the contrast to the Everhart home was jarring. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon, cloves, and the crackle of a real stone fireplace. Willow sat Dash down on a wooden stool and handed him a mug of warm apple cider. As he reached for it, his sleeve slid up, revealing a band of mottled reddish-purple skin around his wrist, the telltale sign of a grip that had been too tight for too long. Willow didn't gasp. She had seen enough in the ER to know that a reaction would only make the child retreat. Instead, she gently took his hand. "Dash, that looks like it hurts. Did you take a tumble in the woods?" Dash looked down at the bruise, then back at Willow, his lower lip trembling. "Moms, Sarah said I have to be steel. Steel doesn't feel the ice." Before Willow could probe further, the back door of her kitchen was rattled by a sharp, authoritative knock. Through the glass, the face of Seraphina Blackwood appeared, her features distorted by the frost on the pane into something monstrous. Willow opened the door, and the warmth of the room was instantly sucked out by the cold emanating from the woman standing on her porch. Sarah was dressed in a floor-length silver mink coat, her eyes scanning the kitchen like a hawk looking for a field mouse. "Asher," she said, her voice a whip-crack of artificial sweetness, "I've been looking everywhere for you. You know we have a schedule to maintain." "He was just helping me with the snow, Mrs. Everhart," Willow intervened, her voice steady, her hazel eyes locking onto Sarah's pale green ones with a clinical intensity. "I noticed he has a bit of a cough. As a nurse, I'd recommend some rest and perhaps a warm, not hot, but warm, compressive wrap for that wrist." The air between the two women turned electric. Sarah's smile didn't falter, but it became a weapon. "How kind of you to offer your professional opinion, Miss Ainsworth. However, Asher is a very active boy. He bruises like a peach just by looking at a tree. We have our own family doctor. Come, Asher, now." She didn't wait for him. She turned and walked away, expecting the boy to follow like a tethered shadow. Dash put down the mug, his eyes losing their spark again, and walked out into the biting wind. Coda lingered for a second, his gaze lingering on Willow as if memorizing her face, before disappearing into the white veil of the snow. Willow stood at the window, watching them go. She looked down at the mug Dash had left. There were small red flecks on the rim, blood from his cracked, dry lips. She felt a cold dread settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the Asheville weather. She knew the signs of discipline that had crossed the line into something much darker. She reached for her phone, her mind racing. She needed to talk to Thorne, but she knew the reputation of the garrison of grief he lived in. She couldn't just barge in. She needed a way to show him the truth without shattering the boy's fragile safety. The chapter ends as the second blizzard of the week officially hits, the wind screaming through the eaves of the manor. Inside his office, Thorne finally opens the baby monitor feed again. But all he sees is a dark room and the glowing eyes of Coda sitting by the bed. He hears a cough, a deep, wet sound that shouldn't come from a 6-year-old. He looks at a photo of Clara on his desk, then at the closed door of his office, the distance between him and his son feeling like an uncrossable ocean of ice. The blizzard outside had evolved into a relentless white wall, isolating the Everhart Manor from the rest of Asheville. Inside Thorne's study, the air was stale, smelling of old leather and the ozone of multiple monitors. Thorne sat motionless, his sharp jawline tight enough to crack stone. The sound of Dash's cough through the baby monitor had been a catalyst, stirring a dormant tactical instinct that had once kept him alive in hostile territories. He realized with a jolt of visceral guilt that while he had been hunting ghosts in his spreadsheets, a predator had likely moved into his hallway. His eyes drifted to the mahogany desk, where a stray corner of paper peeked out from the pocket of his discarded wool overcoat, the one Brenda had handled just before his last trip. He retrieved the crumpled note. It wasn't a formal letter, it was a desperate ledger of anomalies written in Brenda's shaky but precise script. Tuesday, blue lips after bath. Thursday, no dinner for discipline. Coda won't leave the bathroom door. As he read, the gray chips of his eyes darkened into a dangerous, volcanic charcoal. The professional investigator in him began to cross-reference these notes with his own blurred memories. Sarah's overly sweet explanations, Dash's shrinking stature, and the eerie silence that followed whenever he entered a room. He needed more than just a housekeeper's intuition. He needed physical evidence. Thorne moved with the silent, predatory efficiency of a seal, bypassing the creaky floorboards he knew by heart. He headed toward the kitchen, intending to find Brenda, but instead encountered a man he hadn't spoken to in weeks. Standing by the back mudroom was Elias Thorne, no relation, but a man whose name was a strange coincidence, the estate's veteran security consultant. Elias was 65, a retired detective with a face that looked like a crumpled brown paper bag, etched with the weariness of 1,000 crime scenes. He had a short, bristly white buzz cut and a mustache so thick it obscured his upper lip entirely. Elias was a cynical man, skeptical of everyone except Thorne, whom he viewed as a surrogate son. He stood there, smelling of peppermint and gun oil, checking the perimeter cameras on a handheld tablet. "Building's breathing heavy tonight, Thorne," Elias muttered, his voice a low rhythmic rasp. "The new Mrs. She's been real busy reconfiguring the internal sensors. Says she wants privacy. I say she wants a cage." Elias's observation confirmed Thorne's worst fears. "Keep the external feed running, Elias. Don't let her know I'm looking," Thorne commanded, his voice a jagged whisper. He slipped into the laundry room, where Brenda was folding linens, her eyes red-rimmed. When she saw him, she nearly dropped a stack of towels. "Ko Chu," she breathed in Vietnamese, a slip into her native tongue she only made under extreme duress, before correcting herself. "Mr. Thorne, you found it." Thorne held up the note, his expression a mask of controlled fury. "Where is the basin, Brenda? The one you mentioned?" Brenda led him to a small hidden utility closet beneath the back stairs. There, sitting amidst cleaning supplies, was the metallic basin. Thorne knelt, touching the rim. It was freezing, the metal retaining a cruel, lingering chill. Inside, he found a single, sodden thread of navy blue wool. The gravity of the situation hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just losing his son to grief. He was losing him to a systematic breaking of his will. He retreated to the library, but his path was blocked by Serafina. She was draped in a silk robe the color of a bruised plum, a glass of dark wine in her hand. "Still working, darling? You really should rest. I've put Asher to bed. He was quite fussy, probably caught a chill from that nurse next door." Her voice was a silken trap, but for the first time, Thorne saw through the porcelain mask. He saw the way her eyes didn't track with her smile, the way she positioned herself to block the view of the stairs. "I'm going to check on him," Thorne said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth he usually faked for her. Sarah stepped closer, the scent of her expensive, cloying perfume filling his senses. "He's sleeping, Ethan. Don't wake him. You know how hard it is to get him back down." She reached out to touch his scarred temple, but Thorne flinched away, a move that made her green eyes flash with a momentary, sharp malice. "I said, I'm checking on him," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. He brushed past her, his boots thudding with a rhythmic military precision on the stairs. He entered the nursery, which was bathed in a dim, spectral blue light from the moon, reflecting off the snow. Coda was there, a dark, hulking mass at the foot of the bed. The dog didn't wag his tail. He stood up and leaned his weight against Thorne's leg, a gesture of profound relief. Thorne sat on the edge of the bed and pulled back the duvet. Dash was curled in a tight ball, his breathing shallow and hitched. Thorne gently lifted the boy's arm, pulling back the sleeve of the navy sweater. In the moonlight, the bruises Willow had seen were even more vivid, not just on the wrist, but faint, finger-shaped marks on the bicep. Thorne felt a roar of protector rage rising in his chest, the kind of heat that usually preceded a tactical breach. He looked at Coda, then at his son's pale, shivering form. He realized he couldn't just explode. He had to play this like a mission. He had to secure the asset, his son, and neutralize the threat without causing further trauma. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, sending a single encrypted text to Elias. "Kill the internal locks. Secure the guest wing. We're moving." The chapter ends with Thorne standing in the center of the dark nursery, a giant in a room of shadows. He looked at the closed door, knowing Sarah was likely standing on the other side, listening. The silence of the manor was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a fuse burning down. He leaned down and whispered into Coda's ear, "Watch him. Nobody comes in." Coda's low vibrating growl was the only answer he needed. Thorne turned toward his desk in the corner of the room, opening a hidden compartment where he kept a small vintage jewelry box, the one containing Clara's blue diamond ring. He found it empty. The betrayal was now complete. She had stolen the past, she was torturing the present, and she was trying to own the future. The atmosphere within the Everhart manor had shifted from a cold simmer to a volatile, pressurized silence. Outside, the Asheville blizzard reached a terrifying zenith, the wind clawing at the stone masonry like a frantic beast trying to find a way inside. Thorne stood in the center of the dark nursery, the blue moonlight casting long, skeletal shadows across the floorboards. His jaw was set with such force that a muscle jumped rhythmically in his cheek, his slate-gray eyes now twin vortices of cold fury. He didn't just see the bruises on Dash's arm. He felt them as a personal failure of his duty as a father and a protector. The strategic mind that had survived ambushes in the Middle East was now fully engaged, mapping out the architecture of the betrayal that had infiltrated his sanctuary. He reached down and adjusted the navy blue sweater over Dash's shivering form, his touch uncharacteristically tender, before turning to exit the room. He didn't head for his bed. He followed the sound of a hushed, sharp voice emanating from the glass-walled solarium at the end of the east wing. Serafina was there, her silhouette backlit by the rhythmic strobing of lightning that occasionally split the snow-choked sky. She was no longer the poised, silk-clad wife. She paced with a jagged, nervous energy, a burner phone pressed to her ear. Thorne stayed in the shadows of the corridor, taller, his breathing shallow and silent, his body blending into the darkness. "The transfer needs to be finalized before the holiday lockdown," Sarah hissed into the receiver, her voice devoid of its usual melodic artifice. "The boy is becoming problematic. His health is declining faster than anticipated, and Thorne is starting to look up from his files. I need the power of attorney papers signed and backdated by Monday. Once the assets are liquid, the unfortunate tragedy of a grieving widower can take its course." The word struck Thorne like a physical assault, but he didn't move. He was recording everything on a high-fidelity device, concealed in his palm, a tool from his private investigation firm. The depth of her depravity was breathtaking. She wasn't just abusing his son for discipline. She was systematically breaking him to facilitate a hostile takeover of the Everhart estate, viewing Dash as a mere obstacle in a financial ledger. As Sarah turned toward the window, the lightning illuminated a man standing in the shadows of the garden below, looking up at her. It was Julian Vane, Sarah's legal consultant, who had been frequenting the property under the guise of estate planning. Julian was a man of 40, possessing a predatory, polished handsomeness that felt entirely manufactured. He had slicked-back raven hair, a thin, meticulously groomed pencil mustache, and eyes as black and flat as shark's skin. He was a disgraced corporate lawyer known for navigating the darker fringes of inheritance law, a man whose morality had been eroded by a gambling debt that now tied him to Sarah's ambition. He stood in the snow, a dark sentinel in a tailored charcoal overcoat, nodding in silent agreement to her demands. Thorne retreated to the shadows of the grand staircase, his heart hammering a war drum against his ribs. He encountered Elias by the security monitors, the veteran detective's face illuminated by the amber glow of the screens. "She's talking to Vane," Elias whispered, his mustache twitching with distaste. "They're moving fast, Thorne. I've bypassed the internal locks as you ordered, but the blizzard has knocked out the main gate's sensors. We're isolated." Thorne nodded, his gaze fixed on a monitor showing the metallic basin in the utility closet. "Let them move. I want them to think the trap is still open." He then headed toward the kitchen, where Brenda was waiting, her face pale. She handed him a small velvet pouch she had found hidden in the back of the pantry. Inside was Clara's blue diamond ring, its facets dull in the dim light. Sarah hadn't sold it yet. She was keeping it as a trophy. The climax of the night occurred when Thorne decided to force a confrontation, but not with steel, with truth. He entered the solarium just as Sarah was hanging up. She jumped, her porcelain mask slipping for a fraction of a second before the practiced smile returned. "Ethan, you startled me. I was just checking the windows. The storm is getting quite violent." Thorne walked toward her, the space between them shrinking until he was looming over her, his presence suffocating. He held out the velvet pouch. "I found this in the pantry, Sarah, along with Brenda's notes about the lessons you've been giving my son." The air in the solarium seemed to freeze. Sarah's green eyes went wide, then narrowed into slits of emerald fire. The facade didn't just crack, it shattered. "That old hag," she spat, her voice dropping the honeyed tone entirely. "She's been poisoning your mind because she can't stand that I'm the mistress of this house now. And as for Asher, he's weak, Ethan, just like his mother was. I'm trying to save him from himself." Thorne's hand moved faster than she could track, his fingers gripping her wrist. Not with the intent to harm, but with the unbreakable strength of a man who had seen too much. "You will never mention her name again," he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made the glass walls rattle. "And you will never touch my son again. Elias has the house on lockdown. You're not leaving until the authorities arrive." Sarah laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that echoed off the cold glass. "Authorities? In this weather? The roads are impassable, Ethan. And Julian has the papers. By the time anyone gets here, I'll be the legal guardian of this estate. And you'll be just another victim of your own grief." She wrenched her arm away, her eyes darting to the garden, where Julian was nowhere to be seen. In that moment, a massive crash erupted from the foyer. Coda's barking was frantic, joined by the sound of a heavy door being forced open. Thorne ran toward the sound, his tactical instincts screaming. He arrived to find Julian Vane standing in the foyer, snow blowing in behind him, his black eyes fixed on the stairs leading to Dash's room. He held a heavy iron crowbar, his face contorted with a desperate, greedy malice. Julian wasn't a fighter, but he was a man with nothing left to lose. Coda was snarling, his hackles raised, standing at the base of the stairs like a living gargoyle. The chapter ends with Thorne stepping into the light of the foyer, his shadow stretching long and menacing across the marble floor, his fists clenched. "You picked the wrong house, Julian," Thorne whispered, the storm outside finally breaking through the glass of the front door, showering the hall in shards of ice as the two worlds, the domestic and the predatory, finally collided. The front foyer of the Everhart Manor transformed into a theater of war as the blizzard surged through the shattered glass of the entrance. Shards of ice danced in the air like diamonds, catching the dim amber light of the chandelier. Julian Vane stood amidst the debris, his charcoal overcoat dusted with snow, the iron crowbar in his hand trembling not from fear, but from the frantic adrenaline of a man whose financial house of cards was collapsing. He was a cornered rat in a bespoke suit, his pencil mustache twitching as he looked up at the stairs. Above him, Coda was a mountain of obsidian fur and bared fangs, a low tectonic growl vibrating through the floorboards. The dog's eyes were fixed on the iron bar, his ears pinned back in a tactical posture he hadn't assumed since his last deployment in the desert. Thorne stepped into the light, his silhouette immense and terrifying. He didn't rush. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned the darkness. His slate-gray eyes were devoid of heat, filled only with the clinical precision of a seal identifying a target. "Julian," Thorne's voice was a low, jagged rasp that cut through the howling wind. "You've entered a combat zone. There are no lawyers here to save you." Julian snarled, lunging forward with a clumsy, desperate swing of the crowbar. Thorne didn't flinch. He parried the blow with the ease of a veteran, his large hand snapping out to grip Julian's wrist. The sound of bone meeting bone echoed in the hall. With a swift, calculated twist, Thorne disarmed the lawyer, the iron bar clattering onto the marble floor. He didn't stop there. A sharp elbow to the solar plexus sent Julian gasping to his knees, his polished facade finally dissolving into a mask of pathetic terror. While the confrontation unfolded in the foyer, the nursery remained a sanctuary under siege. Dash had woken up to the sound of crashing glass, his small body racked with another violent coughing fit. He sat up, the navy blue sweater itching against his feverish skin, his eyes wide with a fear he couldn't name. Suddenly, a soft tap echoed against the balcony doors, the ones Thorne had forgotten to lock in his haste. A figure emerged from the swirling white chaos of the balcony. It was Willow Ainsworth. She had scaled the trellis from her property, driven by a nurse's intuition and the red flecks she had seen on Dash's mug earlier. She was covered in frost, her chestnut braid caked with snow, her hazel eyes bright with a fierce, protective light. She carried a small medical bag strapped to her waist, her breath coming in ragged plumes of white. "Dash, it's okay. It's just me," Willow whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the storm. She moved toward the bed, her movements efficient and soothing. She ignored the chaos downstairs, focusing entirely on the shivering child. She reached for his wrist, her fingers gently tracing the bruises. "I'm going to help you, Dash. We're going to get you warm." She pulled a thermal emergency blanket from her bag, a thin, crinkling sheet of silver, and wrapped it around him over his navy sweater. She then administered a quick-acting nebulizer treatment she had brought from her clinic, the rhythmic hiss of the medicine providing a mechanical heartbeat to the room. Downstairs, the situation took a darker turn. Serafina emerged from the solarium, her green eyes wild. She wasn't watching Thorne, she was heading for the utility closet where the metallic basin sat. She grabbed a heavy antique fire poker from the hearth, her intent clear. She didn't want the money anymore. She wanted to destroy the evidence of her discipline before the house was fully overrun. She swung at the security monitors, the screen shattering in a spray of sparks. Elias Thorne, the security consultant, intercepted her, his gnarled hands gripping her shoulders. "Enough, Mrs." Elias grunted, his salt and pepper beard bristling. "The game is up. I've already sent the encrypted files to the Asheville PD. They're coming as soon as the plows break through." Sarah screamed, a raw, jagged sound of defeated ambition, struggling against the old man's iron grip. As Thorne stood over the defeated Julian, he heard the hiss of the nebulizer from upstairs, a sound he didn't recognize. His heart leapt into his throat. He bounded up the stairs, 3 at a time, Coda racing beside him. He burst into the nursery, his hand reaching for the concealed holster at his small of his back, only to freeze at the sight. There, in the dim blue light, was the neighbor, Willow, cradling his son. Dash's breathing had slowed, the terrifying bark of his cough replaced by a steady rhythmic wheeze. The silver blanket shimmered like dragon scales around the boy. Willow looked up at Thorne, her hazel eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and clinical judgment. "He has stage 1 hypothermia and a secondary respiratory infection, Mr. Everhart. If I hadn't come over the fence—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Thorne felt the final pillars of his stoicism crumble. He sank to his knees beside the bed, his massive hand reaching out to touch Dash's golden blonde hair. For the first time in a year, he didn't see a dossier or a crime scene. He saw his son. "Thank you," he breathed, the words thick with a grief that was finally being purged. Willow reached out, her smaller, warm hand resting briefly on Thorne's scarred knuckles. "The storm is breaking, Ethan, but the healing is just starting." The chapter ends with a flicker of blue and red lights visible through the frosted windows, not from the police but from a private ambulance Thorne's firm had managed to coordinate through a local mountain rescue team. Silas Vance, the groundskeeper, was outside with a flare, guiding the vehicle through the drifts. Inside, Thorne stood up, his gaze hardening, as he looked toward the door where Sarah was being held. He looked at Willow, then at Dash, who had finally fallen into a deep, medicated sleep, his small hand clutching the silver blanket. The garrison of grief had been breached, but not by the enemy. It had been opened by a woman who refused to look away. The arrival of the private medical team and the local authorities acted as a clinical scalpel, cutting through the thick, toxic atmosphere of the Everhart Manor. The blizzard, as if exhausted by its own violence, had begun to recede, leaving Asheville draped in a ghostly, moonlit silence. Inside, the grand foyer was no longer a home, but a crime scene. Julian Vane had been zip-tied and seated on the floor, his face pale and bruised, while Seraphina stood near the hearth, her silver mink coat stained with slush, her emerald eyes darting like a trapped animal's. Thorne stood on the landing of the stairs, a mountain of silent judgment, watching as Detective Marcus Thorne, his younger brother and a stark contrast in temperament, entered the house. Marcus Thorne was 34, lean and agile, with the same slate-gray eyes as Ethan, but a jawline that was slightly softer, often curved into a cynical smirk. He was a lead investigator for the Asheville PD, known for his relentless pursuit of white-collar criminals. Unlike Ethan's stoic silence, Marcus was a man of sharp, rapid-fire wit, his dark hair cut in a stylish taper and his face clean-shaven, save for a meticulously maintained shadow of a goatee. He had joined the force following the suspicious death of their mother years ago, an event that had turned him into a skeptic of accidental tragedies. He moved through the room with a notepad in hand, his gaze lingering on the shattered glass and the metallic basin that Silas had retrieved from the closet. "Hell of a Christmas party, Ethan," Marcus remarked, his voice a low baritone that managed to be both comforting and professional. He gestured towards Sarah. "We've got the recording from your device and the files Elias intercepted, but there's something else." He held up a transparent evidence bag containing the blue diamond ring Brenda had found. "We found trace amounts of a digitalis-based compound in the lining of the velvet box this came from. It's a heart medication, Ethan. The same kind Clara was taking." Thorne felt the world tilt. The implication was a physical blow to his solar plexus. Clara's heart incident hadn't been an act of God. It had been an act of slow, methodical sabotage. Sarah hadn't just entered his life to steal his future. She had cleared the path by erasing his past. Sarah's composure finally disintegrated. "She was weak!" she shrieked, her voice cracking against the marble walls. "She didn't deserve this life, this house, or you. I was the one who could make you great again." Marcus didn't flinch. He signaled to the uniformed officers. "Seraphina Blackwood, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Asher Everhart, grand larceny, and pending further investigation into the homicide of Clara Everhart." As they led her out into the freezing night, she didn't look back at the house, only at the ring in the bag, her greed outlasting her sanity. Upstairs, the nursery had become a sanctuary of healing. Willow Ainsworth sat by Dash's bed, her hand resting on the boy's chest, monitoring the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing. The nebulizer had done its work, and the silver thermal blanket kept the warmth locked in. Coda was curled up at the foot of the bed, his head resting on his paws, his eyes never leaving Willow. The dog had accepted her as part of the pack, a silent acknowledgement of the life she had saved. Thorne entered the room, the weight of the revelation about Clara making his steps heavy. He looked at Willow, who was bathed in the soft glow of a salt lamp she had brought from her house. "The police are taking them away," Thorne whispered, sitting in the armchair opposite her. He looked older in the dim light, the lines around his eyes etched deep with a year's worth of suppressed mourning. Willow looked at him, her hazel eyes filled with a profound, quiet understanding. "I heard what Marcus said downstairs, Ethan. You can't carry the guilt of what you didn't know. You were fighting a ghost. She was a monster in the flesh." Thorne shook his head, his hand reaching out to touch the navy blue wool of Dash's sleeve. "I should have seen it. I'm a SEAL, Willow. I'm trained to see the enemy." Willow stood up, moving to his side and placing a hand on his shoulder. "The enemy you're trained for wears a uniform or carries a gun. They don't sleep in your bed and smile at your son. Forgive yourself, for his sake." In the kitchen below, Brenda and Silas sat at the wooden table, a pot of strong Vietnamese coffee between them. The house was finally quiet, the predatory energy of the night replaced by the weary peace of survivors. Brenda was weeping quietly, a mixture of grief for Clara and relief for Dash. Silas, his gnarled hand resting on hers, didn't say a word. He just watched the snow settle on the windowsill, knowing that for the first time in a long time, the shadows in the Everhart Manor were just shadows, not secrets. The chapter ends with a quiet moment between Thorne and Willow. As the first light of a grum, snowy dawn began to bleed through the curtains, Dash stirred. He opened his cerulean eyes, looked at his father, then at Willow, and finally at Coda. A small, weak smile touched his lips. "Is the ice gone?" he asked, his voice a tiny rasp. Thorne leaned over and kissed his forehead, his own eyes glistening. "The ice is gone, Dash. It's never coming back. We're going to be okay." Willow looked at Thorne, and in that exchange of glances, a new foundation was laid, one built on truth rather than the fragile porcelain of a lie. The garrison of grief was no longer a prison. It was a home waiting to be rebuilt. The week leading up to Christmas in Asheville saw the mountain peaks draped in a soft, forgiving blanket of fresh powder, a stark contrast to the jagged, predatory ice of the previous blizzard. The Everhart Manor, once a cold monument to grief and hidden cruelty, had undergone a visceral transformation. The heavy, dark velvet curtains that Seraphina had insisted upon were replaced with airy linens, allowing the pale winter sunlight to spill across the reclaimed mahogany floors. The scent of ozone and disinfectant had been banished, replaced by the warm, aromatic embrace of pine needles, roasted chestnuts, and the sweet, yeasty promise of Brenda's holiday baking. The house was no longer a garrison. It was breathing again. Thorne stood on the back porch, his frame silhouetted against the rising sun. The sharp edges of his exhaustion had been blunted, replaced by a quiet, focused peace. He was dressed in a rugged shearling jacket and dark jeans, his jawline shadowed by a neat, thick beard that he had finally found the time to groom. Beside him stood Coda, the German shepherd's ears forward, his tail wagging in slow, contented sweeps. Coda's role as a sentry had shifted. He was no longer guarding a victim, but participating in the life of a family. The dog's eyes followed a small figure in a navy blue sweater, now freshly laundered and smelling of cedar, who was running across the yard with a newfound, breathless joy. Dash was no longer the shivering ghost of the marble bathroom. Under the careful, clinical, yet tender eye of Willow, his recovery had been swift. The blue had vanished from his lips, replaced by a healthy, wind-chilled rose. He was currently engaged in a mission of great importance, constructing a massive snow fort for the great Christmas battle. He was aided by a new face in the Everhart circle, Arthur "Artie" Penhaligon, a retired Navy SEAL veteran and Thorne's former commanding officer. Artie was a man of 65, built like a fire hydrant, short, barrel-chested, and seemingly indestructible. He had a bald, scarred head and a massive white handlebar mustache that twitched when he laughed, which was often. Artie had moved to the mountains to run a survival school, but he had dropped everything to help Thorne rebuild the perimeter of his life. He was a man of gruff affection, treating Dash with a mixture of military discipline and grandfatherly indulgence. "Move those ice blocks to the flank, Dash. We need a solid defensive line for the snowball barrage," Artie bellowed, his voice a jovial thunder. Dash giggled, a sound that Thorne still stopped to listen to every time it echoed through the trees. The boy lunged into the snow, Coda barking in playful circles around him. The metallic basin, the very one that had been a vessel of torment, sat in the middle of the yard, but its purpose had been redeemed. Silas Vance had spent the morning scrubbing it clean and filling it with warm water from the kitchen. It now served as a temporary soaking station for Dash's frozen mittens and a place for Coda to drink. The symbol of the cold had been repurposed by the warmth of a father's care. Willow Ainsworth stepped out onto the porch, carrying 2 steaming mugs of cocoa. She looked radiant in a cream-colored cable-knit sweater, her chestnut hair falling loose over her shoulders. The professional distance she had maintained as a nurse had melted into something deeper, more personal. She handed a mug to Thorne, her fingers lingering against his for a second longer than necessary. "Artie is going to turn that backyard into a tactical bunker if we don't call them in for lunch soon," she teased, her hazel eyes dancing with light. Thorne smiled, a real, unburdened smile that reached his slate-gray eyes. "Let them play, Willow. They've both earned a bit of peace." The conversation turned to the future. Marcus had called earlier to confirm that the case against Serafina and Julian Vane was airtight. The digitalis evidence, combined with Brenda's testimony and the financial records Elias had recovered, ensured they would be behind bars for a very long time. The garrison of grief was finally legally and spiritually cleansed. Thorne looked at Willow, his expression turning serious. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did that night. You didn't just save his life, you saved mine." Willow shook her head gently. "You saved yourself, Ethan. You just needed someone to hold the light while you found the way back." As the afternoon light began to fade into a soft, golden twilight, the family gathered in the grand foyer. The shattered glass had been replaced by a beautiful stained glass transom that cast rainbows across the marble floor. A massive spruce tree stood in the corner, decorated with handmade ornaments Dash had crafted with Brenda's help. At the very top sat a small golden star, a gift from Willow. Under the tree sat a single small velvet box. Thorne picked it up and handed it to Dash. "This belongs to you, son, to keep safe for the future." Dash opened it to find his mother's blue diamond ring, sparkling with a renewed brilliance. "It's like a piece of the sky," Dash whispered. Thorne nodded, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "It's a piece of home." The journey of Thorne and Dash is more than just a victory over betrayal. It is a profound testament to an eternal truth. Light will always find its way, even through the thickest blizzard. Sometimes in our own lives we feel surrounded by the biting cold of injustice or the silence of suffering. But remember, God never leaves us to face the storm alone. He sends quiet miracles, the fierce loyalty of a companion like Coda, the courage of a neighbor like Willow, or the awakening of a father's protective spirit. The very basin that was once a vessel of pain was redeemed and filled with warmth. This is how grace works. It takes our broken pieces and crafts them into a foundation for a new beginning. In your everyday walk, never hesitate to be the light for someone else. A small act of kindness or a watchful eye might be the very miracle someone else is praying for. Trust that after every harsh winter, the spring of hope is guaranteed to return by His hand.